Hey, 7th grade, Mr. Herzberg here. Today is Wednesday, May 13th, which means it's time for the next 10 pages of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. We're going to go over our journal and Monday night's homework. Let's get started. Okay, this week's standard, don't forget, is reading an informational text 7.6. And your job is number your Google Doc 1 through 8. And the directions tell us to read each description, determining the author's purpose, entertain, persuade, or inform. Explain your answer on the lines. So let's get started. Number 1, the story of a girl who started taking drugs and her life and future fall apart. So obviously that would be to persuade, because the author wants to persuade us, the reader, that drugs are not a good idea. They lead to nothing but problems. So how we know that is because her life fell apart, cause and effect. She did drugs and her life and future fell apart. So, persuade. That's all you're doing on these in your Google Doc. There's a grand total of 8. So do all 8 of those. You can just put P, I, or P, persuade P, inform I, or entertain E. So P-I-E, pie, okay? Let me know if you have any questions. Let's go over the homework real quick. Almost closed that, but not yet. You guys had to answer some questions from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I hope you're enjoying this book so far. It's one of my favorites. It's always been a favorite since I was little, so I thought I'd give you guys a chance to do these. How did Tarrytown get its name? How did Sleepy Hollow get its name? Tarrytown got its name because all the men tarried around. In other words, they kind of lazed about the town, and the wives were the ones doing all the work. So to tarry is to kind of meander around, to dodge what you're supposed to be doing, essentially, and that's what tarrying means. How did Sleepy Hollow get its name? It was kind of a sleepy town. No one ever really did anything. It was very lazy, sort of relaxed, but nothing exciting ever happened. What mood does the setting of the story create? It creates a very sort of gloomy, uneventful, slow-paced. Who do the villagers believe the Headless Horseman is? A Hessian trooper from the Revolutionary War. And Hessian just means they were from a Germanic country. How did he lose his head? A cannonball. A blast of a cannonball decapitated him. What do villagers think he is doing out at night, and why is he said to be in such a hurry? They are believing that he's going from the church on the road to where he's buried, his body without a head, and he goes all the way out to the bridge and back looking for his head, because they think that may be where the battle happened. And he's in a rush because he has to do this before the sun rises every night. So from the time the sun sets to the time the sun rises, it's believed this is when his ghost goes out looking for his head. What is Ichabod Crane's job? He is a school teacher. What other job did he earn a little more money? He taught the kids how to sing, and at church on Sundays he did sort of the choir for the kids, and he made a little extra money on that. He also did tutoring. He also went to some of these wives' houses and helped tutor their kids. Where does Ichabod Crane live? He lives in the schoolhouse. Actually, excuse me, take that back. He boards with his students' parents. And what boards means, he kind of rents rooms from different parents throughout the town. Why does he need to be able to have all of his belongings in a small bundle? Because the state of New York moves him from one small city to the next to go help them if they need a teacher in that town. He goes there and fills that position. So he's always he's kind of like a nomad. What are 2 things that Ichabod would do to make himself useful to the farmers? He would help the wives tend to the kids, and he would also help the wives with eating their food. How does he help the wives? He helps them out by eating their food, trying out their different recipes, and with the kids. And why do the women in the countryside think he is an important person? Because of all the work he does educating and teaching the kids how to sing. And how do the mothers treat him as a result? They treat him very well. They spoil him. And how do younger girls respond to him? They're all really impressed by him. This is a farming community, a very simple town, meaning a lot of these people have a very limited education. They stopped going to school at a young age so they can focus all their energy on farming. So Ichabod's had a lot of education and a lot of schooling, so they're very impressed by that. And he can sing, so and as a result, they kind of cook him all the best food. Whenever he's staying in a different house, he gets treated and spoiled by these wives, kind of making the husbands a little bit jealous sometimes. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next 10 pages. We're going to go today from page top of, let's see here, I think I stopped at the top of page 11, and we're going to go all the way to page 21. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the Dutch wives. Ichabod would like to watch as they sat spinning by the fire with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and haunted brooks and bridges and houses, and particularly, Ichabod liked hearing the story of the Headless Horseman, or the Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft and the direful omens of the portentous sights and sounds in the air, which pervaded in the early times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn round, and that they were half the time topsy-turvy. But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, and where, of course, no spectre dared to show its face, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walks home. What fearful shapes and shadows would get in Ichabod's path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of the snowy night? With what wistful look did his eyes ever trembling ray of light streaming across the waste fields from some distant window? How often Ichabod was appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path. How often did he shriek with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder, lest he should behold some uncouth being trampling close behind him. And how often Ichabod was thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast howling among the trees, and the idea that it was the Galloping Hessian on one of its nightly scourings. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of his mind, and the walk in darkness, though he had seen many spectres in his time, had been more than once beset by Satan in divers shapes in his lonely preambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils. And he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in despite of the devil and all his works. In his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and a whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. And here's a picture here of Ichabod delighting equally with his anecdotes by witchcraft here. The people of the town, two of the Dutch women telling him some stories of witches and goblins and ghosts. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening in each week to receive his instructions in psalms for church was one Katrina Van Tassel. She was the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer in town. She was a blooming woman of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy cheeks as one of her father's peaches. And she was universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. Katrina was withal a little of a coquette, as one might be perceived, even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions as most suited to set off her charm. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Saradom, the tempting stomacher of the olden time, and withal a provoking short petticoat, to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country all around. Ichabod Crane had a soft, foolish heart towards the opposite sex, and if it is not to be wondered at, that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited Katrina in her paternal mansion. Her father, Baltus Van Tassel, was a perfect picture of thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer, He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it, and piqued himself upon the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. Baltus's stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson River, in one of those green-sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers were so fond of. A great elm tree spread its branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the sweetest water in a little well, formed of a barrel, and then stole sparkling away through the grass to a neighboring brook, that babbled along among alders and dwarf willows. Hard by the farmers was a vast large barn, that might have served for a church, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures. The flail was busily resounding within it. From morning to night, swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and rows of pigeons, some with one eye turned up, watching the weather, or buried their bosoms on other swelling and cooing in their dames, enjoying the sunshine of the barn roof. Sleek, unruly porkers and grunting of the repose and abundance of their pens went sailed forth, as if in the stuff in the air. A stately squadron of geese were riding in adjoining ponds, conveying whole fleets, like ill-tempered housewives with their peevish, discontented cries. Before the barn door strutted again the gallant crow, patterned of a husband, a warrior and a fine gentleman, clapped its bruising wings, and crowed in the gladness of his heart, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, then generously calling his ever-hungry family of children to enjoy the morsel he had discovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon the sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured himself a roasting pig, running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in its mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in comfortable pie and tucked in with a corset of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks paring cozily dishes, like snug married couples, with its gizzards in its wings, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages, and even a bright Chanticleer himself sprawling on his back in a side dish with upturned claws, as if craving a quarter, with Ichabod's chivalrous spirit, disdained to ask while living. As all of this enraptured Ichabod fancied all of this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadow lands of buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards birthed with ruddy fruit, and his heart warmed at the tenement of Katrina Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and her imagination expanded with the idea how they may be readily turned into cash at the moment of investment in the immense tracts of the land. Ichabod's busy fancy was already realizing his hopes, and presented to him blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children, mounted on top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When Ichabod entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with low roofs, built in the style of the Dutch, the low projecting eaves from piazza, and the capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under the hung flails harnessed various utensils of husbandry and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Branches were built along the sides of summer use, and a great spinning wheel at the end showed the various uses for which the important porch might be devoted. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall which formed the center of the mansion. Here rows of resplendent pewter ranged on the long dresser dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool ready to be spun. In another, from the loom, ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples hung in a happy festoon along the walls, mingled with the gaud of red peppers on the door. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at the end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter, Katrina Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more difficulties than generally fell to on the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such easily conquered adversaries to contend with, and had many to make his way merrily through the gates in iron and brass, and the walls of adamant, the castled keep, where the lady of his heart was confined. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of the country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which, forever presenting new difficulties and impediments, had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries, of flesh and blood, and other admirers, who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful, angry eye on anyone, but ready to fly out in the common cause against a new competitor. Among these was the most formidable was a burly, roistering blade by the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brahms van Brunt, the hero of the country road, which hung with his feats of strength and hardihood. Brom was a broad-shouldered, double-jointed, with a short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he received the nickname Brombones, by which he was universally known. He was a farmer. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in his horsemanship, being as dexterous on a horse as a Tartar. He was the foremost of all races and cockfights. With the ascendancy with bodily strength always acquired in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions of air, and that admitted no gainsay or appeal. Brom was always ready for either a fight or a wrestling frolic. He had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with his overbearing roughness there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at the bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions of his own stamp, who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud merriment for miles round. In cold weather, Brom was distinguished by a fur cap, surmounted with a flaunting fox's tail, and when the folks of the country gathered described this well-known crest at a distance, whisking about among a squad of hard riders, they always stood for a squall. Sometimes Brom's crew would be heard dashing around the farmhouse at midnight, with whoops and hollows and the troop of Don Cossacks. And the old dames started off their sleep, would listen for a moment, and the hurry-scurry clattered by, and exclaimed, "Ah, there goes Brombones and his gang." The neighbors would look upon him with mixture of awed admiration and goodwill. And when they all pranked and rustic brawls occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brombones was probably at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she didn't altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, though, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no incantation to cross a lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's palling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or as it's termed, sparking, within, all suitors passed by in despair, and carried their war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things a stouter man that he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser would have despaired, he had, however, a mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough, though but bent he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, the moment it was away, jerk, he was erect and carried his head as high as ever. All right, we're going to stop there. Here is a picture of broad-shouldered, double-jointed, curly, black-haired, unpleasant countenance Brombones right here. His description always reminds me of Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. Similar type of personality, very sort of athletic, and dared other men to try and get in his way. So Ichabod, the school teacher, got his eye on Katrina Van Tassel, and she is the daughter of the rich farmer Van Tassel, and Ichabod wants to get with her so he can enjoy her wealth. Bit of a gold digger Ichabod is, but he doesn't care. But as we learned in this chapter, Ichabod has competition in the form of Brom van Brunt, or they call him Brombones. And so Ichabod doesn't care. He's going to go after Katrina anyways, even after Brom is going after her. So this is going to set into motion. We're going up the roller coaster of literature here. We're going to the rising action, getting close to the climax. And all of this under the guise of we're still hearing stories of a haunted Hessian headless horseman riding through town. We've got stories of witchcraft and all sorts of other strange things going on. But Ichabod, he walks home at night after leaving the mother's houses, getting fed, and he hears things and stuff, but by and large it doesn't bother him. He writes it off, the sun rises, and he forgets about it. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm going to upload all your questions onto Google Classroom. I'll see you guys next time.